What's your got fired but was totally worth it story? Worked at a big supermarket chain. Did cashier job, placed out products and some behind the scenes management. One day I get called to the back. It was the regional manager, said my deficit after my shifts as cashier is getting out of control, about 10 to 50 bucks every shift. Threatened me with cops saying that they surveillance videos showing me stealing the money. I said sure, get the cops here, I'll just wait. After 30 minutes cops arrived. When we started watching the footage there was nothing showing that I stole the money. Cops said there is no evidence against me and took off. I still got fired on the spot, and they even banned me from entering their stores all over the country. Few weeks later I get a call from the girl that was working there with me, covering me for smoke breaks when I was cashier. Teared up, choking from crying. It was her stealing the money all the time while I used my breaks. Got charges pressed against her, did 120 hours community service, and paid a huge fine. Few days after that I get a call from regional manager apologizing for the inconvenience and asking me if I want to return. Told him to fuck off and hung up. I was working in a small accounting firm making less than minimum wage $30,000. Minimum wage in Australia is $38,000. The boss was exploiting the fact that people like me were desperate to get their foot into the door of accounting as it is very competitive in Australia. One day I was stupidly posting on a forum about my situation and looking for advice. The boss found out and fired me on the spot. Feeling pretty spiteful about the whole thing, I reported my situation to Fair Work Ombudsman Australia. A month later I got payment for the amount I should have been making at minimum wage for the 6 months I was there. About a month after that I landed a much better role at large company making almost double what I was making previously. The icing on the cake is the firm ended up getting investigated by Fair Work and I can only assume they received a hefty fine because they are no longer in business. Was working at Little Caesars at the time, was probably my second month or so. About an hour before my shift starts, my mom calls and says my grandma fell down the stairs and is at the hospital and I need to go right away since she works farther away and I can get to her first. I call Elsie to tell them I can't come in and my boss said if I don't come in, I'll be fired. I say okay and hang up. A few hours later I get a voicemail saying I've been let go from Elsie. Totally worth it to make it to my grandma to check on her. I worked in a bar with an awful boss. He would always flirt with the young female bar staff making us all uncomfortable, even though he was 50Y/0. We all knew his wife and 2 young children, but about 6 months into me working there he began to date a 22-year-old customer. By date, I mean he used to go downstairs to his office and sleep with her while he was on shift. No one was allowed to talk about it, but we all knew. Quite quickly he knocked her up and ended up breaking up with his wife, but he still flirted with his staff relentlessly even when his new baby was born. He once told a male employee that he liked asking female bar staff to pick up things from low shelves so we would bend over and he could check out our ass. So anyway, he always used to break health and safety rules if he could get out of doing a task he didn't want to. He was prolific for asking bar staff to clean human waste, vomit/poop customers had done on the floor, even though legally anyone cleaning that stuff needed to have passed a certain health and safety qualification. I spoke to my assistant manager about this, and she confirmed that only management can do it, and I should refuse next time. One day he demanded I cleaned up vomit in the male toilets, and I refused, repeating what the assistant manager told me. My boss went absolutely mad. He wasn't used to people standing up to him. He told me to come downstairs to his office to speak about it. At that moment I knew I wanted to quit, so I told him I won't be going downstairs with him. He asked me why, and I replied, the last girl who went down there with you ended up getting pregnant, so that's gonna be a nope from me. Lost my job but worth it. I worked at a place in Grand Bend, Ontario. I was the chef. The year before I was hired, they'd left the place a mess and violated health code to the point where they had been cited. I was working uphill against that and a crazy owner who would rather act like she was 21 than run her fucking business. On a July evening, someone stuck a hot dirty sauté pan into my stack of cool clean pans. I wrapped my hand around it and, man, That was an intense level of pain. Literally had to peel the pan from my hand. Crazy owner wouldn't let me call an ambulance because it would be bad for business. Insisted I run service from the other side of the line. I took a few days medical leave after that, all the while fielding harassing phone calls saying how I was letting them down. This place was awful, and I'd had no staff for weeks because, again, ownership ran them off. I handed in my notice, and was promptly escorted off the property. It was gratifying to watch their reviews sink after that. Food going out cold, moldy mushroom burgers, etc. Unreasonable sales targets, and in the middle of a 1:1 with my boss, who was asking me how I planned to make up for the deficit. I said, "Find Jesus." She responded she'd given it a lot of thought, and admitted not being able to think of anything on which I could be doing better, but use the "Find Jesus" comment to later get me fired. In such a better role now, not only was the sarcasm worth it, where I'm now is. Worked in a government office, where it's typical to wring hands, deny responsibility, and shift the burden onto citizens, even if it's the state that made the mistake. I had a county prosecutor calling repeatedly trying to obtain some documents. It was a drunk driver case. The guy was facing down some serious charges and they were trying to build their case and determine the extent of charges against him. Absolutely someone who needed to be put away. Everything in policy said they were entitled to it, but the person who normally furnishes it was constantly out with all manner of excuses. I finally got sick of putting it off, stalling them, making excuses for her. I pulled the info myself and sent it. That didn't break any laws or policy, but they decided to sack me for it because I'd overstepped. But I'd do it again. Went into a business meeting for the ice cream shop I managed Boldstone. I was told that the girl that was 7 months pregnant need to be written up as much as possible so they could have a legal reason to fire her. Told them it wasn't going to happen, and they suggested that I put in my 2 weeks and find other work. So I did. Then I was told that I was going to be gone in 2 weeks and might as well just fire her. Was no way in hell I would do that. I walked into that meeting with a 50-hour-a-week decent paying job and left with nothing but my integrity. I then proceeded to drive to my store and pull the girl aside and let her know what was going on. Last I checked, I believe she manages a store now. Was working in dialysis when another competing company came to town, effectively eliminating the monopoly my current company had on treating kidney failure. The company I worked for had already lost their physician group and was so afraid of losing staff and the patients that would follow them to the new company they gave out huge retention bonuses. After receiving my bonus, I was fired for a manufactured problem beyond my control. I was hired by the new company, got a $10,000 signing bonus, and took a couple dozens patients with me to the new company. Got my picture in the new company's brochure they mailed out to all the dialysis patients, so they knew where I ended up. Just having a new company come to town to provide competition was also amazing for the patients. They got new heated massage chairs and new TVs with more channels and better/more staff to take care of them. The old company's dialysis centers across town that did not get competing dialysis units put nearby didn't give those patients anything. I was working a full-time job and 3 part-time jobs. I worked every day, and on the weekends I would work nights. I rarely slept, and this went on for 6 months. One of the jobs was for the well-known lotion and scent store. The pay and hours really didn't make a difference, but I enjoyed working there. My manager was going out of town and was leaving a new supervisor in charge I hadn't gotten to know all too well, and he did not like me for some reason. Well, the stars aligned, and I got a weekend off except for a morning shift with them. My manager, before she left, offered me the day off, but me knowing it would leave her short-handed, I declined. She told me that if I overslept or was late it was okay due to how much I've been working. So I go home that night and crash out hard. The feeling of my bed was the greatest thing. I set my alarms and out I went. I woke up over 30 hours later not realizing I had slept through my shift until I saw the voicemail on my phone. The new supervisor had fired me and put me down as a no-call no-show, which was rightfully so. I called the store and he refused to talk to me. So I called the manager and told her what happened. She said it was fine and would take care of it and to come for my next scheduled shift. Well, long story short, this little ass of a supervisor submitted my termination files to corporate and classified me as an overhire. My manager was pissed and fired him shortly afterwards. The sleep was the best I had had in years and still on my top 10 sleeps. Totally worth getting labeled as an overhire. I worked at a radio station in the late 80s. Part-time. The way up the ladder was that you got hired part-time. Then as the full-time people moved up and out, you were slotted in for promotion based on how long you'd worked there. I'd worked my way up to the top of the part-time heap. The next full-time slot that opened was mine by virtue of seniority. But the next job that opened up was the midday show. That show had always been hosted by a female, and while I was next on the list, the job was given to a woman who'd worked for the station for a grand total of 2 weeks. She was terrible. It was unfair. And I expressed this in a letter to the program director. I got fired for having an attitude. It was the best career move I ever made. I walked out of that place with my head held high, and within a year, was working at a much larger station on my way to a career in major markets. Last I heard, my old boss is still there in charge of that little station. I worked at a cafe chain known for soups, sandwiches, and salads throughout high school. I was good friends with exactly 3 people, but whenever our group got to close a store it was always a fun time. We ended up taking the headsets for the drive-thru after that had closed, and we were just messing around chatting while cleaning up. There was a particularly attractive new manager that had been hired recently, and she was a bit of a hot topic between a group of high school guys. We were unaware that the store mix and cameras ran to an app on the manager's phone. We all got called in the next day. They didn't fire us. Oh no, it was much worse. The manager had a good sense of humor. She made printouts of our conversation and made us repeat it verbatim to the new hot manager, who was in tears laughing at how terrible we felt. Taught us a good lesson. Good managing right there. I was hired as a consultant in a kitchen along with another person. She was more qualified than I was in the science of cooking, no doubt about that. She couldn't stand me and questioned my ability, a craft I have been in for 10+ years. She got the lead position with me under her and a young kid who was days from being fired. I took the young guy and turned him into a real cook, who is now a chef back in his home state. I was told by GM how I was a godsend for them and how I was such a role model for the young guy. The woman who was now chef would sit in the kitchen and work on dishes for 4+ hours without making any decisions, and had the 2 of us doing everything and never checking in on us. Most of the time, when we would be back up in the kitchen, she would be just sitting there. She was collecting money and putting no real work in. She never added any dishes to the menu other than a few specials that weren't anything to write home about. I called her out on it, and she kept telling me my work wasn't up to snuff for the restaurant. I'd come in the next day and nail it, then it was something else. I'd change what I was doing and correct the issue she had, and then something new would be wrong. Finally one day I was alone in the kitchen. Because the young guy was on vacation, she was at a funeral, and I was sick as a dog. I shouldn't have been in the kitchen, but I was, and had a fever and all. The next day she told me she was grateful for me doing what I did, but I could have done a better job. I told her that if she didn't like the job I did, to either shut it or fire me. The next day I obviously knew I would be fired. You can't talk to a chef like that, and I understand that. So at the end of the shift the GM and the chef sat me down and asked me if I knew why we were talking, and I turned to the GM and went off on how I shouldn't have been in the kitchen at all the day before, how all these random issues with my performance would come up and be correctly instantly, and the next day there was something new, and I looked at the chef and said she's full of shit and she just didn't like me and targeted me because of it. The GM of the restaurant then explains how yes, they were letting me go, but they wanted to give me a severance for me leaving my last job to come to them as a consultant. I was actually surprised that's not a common thing in the kitchen at all, and was a bit embarrassed because of it, and said so, but that it didn't change anything I meant or said. The GM caught me on the way out and said how he agreed with me, but he was required to listen to the chef as well. Less than 2 months later she turned her anger on the kid and fired him, and 6 months later she was let go herself. I hired the kid at my current job before he moved back home. I have been at my current kitchen for 3 years, and I manage a mobile kitchen that has 2 permanent spaces and work pop-ups and concerts and such. I still hate her with all my heart. Laziness has no place in a kitchen. The only great thing I can say about all the work I had to do there was I was jacked from literally lifting things by myself up and down stairs from prep to kitchen. My arms and core never looked better. I worked as an internal audit intern for a local municipality. I was 20 years old and hadn't even taken an audit class yet. After a few weeks I realized quickly I was underqualified for the HR job, but I still tried to learn and work my ass off. I noticed there were some issues with the policies and procedures in place. For example, missing money and weak controls. Anytime I brought it up, the manager would sweep it under the rug and ignore it. Long story short, I had a huge argument with her and she let me go. 3 months later the FBI show up at my door. They asked me a few questions about my old manager. Turns out she conspired with the mayor to accept donations in exchange for certain actions. Not sure what those actions were. Anyway, she got fired and got charged with 10 other city officials. Was an assistant store manager at Lowe's and decided to go back to school to become a teacher and drop down to an hourly position for 3 months. And then I was going to leave the company after that to study full time. The day before the transfer they fired me, which saved them from paying me half of my saved up vacation time, which was worth about $300. As I'm being led out of the store, my buddy in hours says you can get unemployment and slides me a note with the phone number. I get 6 months of unemployment at $300 a week. Reported coworker for sexually harassing a minor. Manager fired me for making the accusation against her friend. She got fired. The district manager got fired. He got fired after he was caught in a bathroom with a minor.